everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Josh McDaniel. I work with the Wallow Fire Lessons Learned Center, and I'll be moderating the webinar today and introducing the two speakers, and then also moderating the question and answer session after the presentation. I'm going to start off making a few quick notes and announcements. The webinar series we say monthly webinar series, but we've actually gone to sort of a bi-monthly webinar series, so I'll show you the upcoming webinar also, and then I'll tell you where to go to find out the schedule. But the webinar series is sponsored by three organizations: the International Association of Wildland Fire, the Joint Fire Science Program, and the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center. So I want to encourage everyone to check out those three organizations. Got to put a plug in for them. And first I want to point out that the International Association of Wildland Fire is hosting a conference that's going on right now in Seattle, the third Human Dimensions of Wildland Fire Conference. And the conference is streaming online. You can actually register for the conference online, and I believe every session is streaming. There is a fee for that service, but might be well worth it if you have the opportunity to do that. Go to the IAWF website, which is listed there at the bottom, and you can navigate your way to the conference page and register there. Also, put a plug in for JFSP. The Joint Fire Science Program has, if you're familiar with their publications, they are really useful, really valuable. They've been, for a few years now, putting out some really great syntheses of fire science and in a variety of forms, and their website has just recently been redesigned, and there's some great resources there, so I really encourage you to check it out. And then, of course, the Wildland Fire Science Center, which I work for, has also got some great resources on it as well. There's a whole suite of sites there. The Advances in Fire Practice is the fire science page. Then there's also the My Fire Community, which is sort of an online networking site, and then the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center site, which has also been producing a lot of great resources as well. Okay, so the next webinar in the series is coming up on May 3rd. Gary Ottmeyer is going to give a presentation on the causes and movement of smoke-induced fog. So this is what Gary refers to as super fog. And super fog is it's a phenomenon in the sort of a nighttime phenomenon of smoke and fog mix. It makes a real dense, a low visibility smoke that's often responsible for traffic incidents. And there was a huge pileup on the Florida interstate a few months ago that resulted in quite a few fatalities. And so that should be a pretty interesting webinar as he presents some new research on that. Okay, so for the webinars, the link for that webinar is there at the bottom. So it's the Advances in Fire Practice homepage, and that's a tough link to just read out. But if you Google Advances in Fire Practice, it'll take you there, or you can get there through the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center site. Okay, so on to today's webinar. I'll introduce the speakers in just a second, but first I want to let you know how questions work. Down at the bottom right of your control panel to the right, there should be a box that says questions or chat, depending on what platform you're on. And you can type in your questions there at any time. And we encourage you to get those questions in early. And we'll collect them, and at the end of the presentation, we'll read them out, and the speakers will respond to them. So as the presentation is going on, go ahead and get your questions in, and we'll try to get to all of them by the end. Also, the webinar is being recorded, and that webinar, the recording of that is posted on the Advances in Fire Practice webpage for a week or so, and then we archive it on the Frames website. So you can pass along the link to anyone that you think might be interested in the webinar, and then later on you can get to the through the Advances in Fire Practice page, you can get to the archives and look at any of the other webinars that we've archived there. And it's a pretty growing. There's 40 or 50 webinars archived at this point, I believe. All right, so that should take care of the housekeeping. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the speakers now. So the two speakers are Josh Hall and Emily Irwin. Josh Hall is an air and water quality specialist for the New Mexico National Forest and serves as the Forest Service liaison to the New Mexico Environment Department. Over the last couple of years, he's been actively involved in smoke issues and smoke regulations related to wildland fire in New Mexico. This past summer, he worked as a part of a team in an unprecedented interagency response to significant smoke issues resulting from the record 2011 wildfires in the Southwest. Emily Irwin is the program leader for fire, fuels, and smoke for Region 3 of the Forest Service, that's the Southwest. She started with the Forest Service about 20 years ago and has spent her entire career in the Southwest region working on the Coconino and the Gila National Forests. She moved up to the regional office about 10 years ago and was the lead coordinator for the Fire Use Training Academy. So welcome, Josh and Emily, and I'll turn it over to you now. There we go.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emily Irwin, and Josh and I are sitting here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and we're going to tag team this presentation and hopefully some discussion here, and we're anticipating it'll take about an hour. So again, I work out of the regional office for the Forest Service in the Southwest region and provide program leadership in fuels, fire ecology, and smoke management.
And thanks. I'm Josh Hall. I work with the Forest Service. I'm liaison for the New Mexico Forest to the Environment Department in New Mexico, and have been working on smoke issues and privileged enough to work with a great team of people over the past year or so.
So today, the purpose of today's webinar is to highlight the smoke coordination efforts that occurred throughout the Southwest area during the fire season 2011, last summer. And this fire season, 2011, was unprecedented on several fronts, and primarily just the cumulative smoke impacts on populations and the toll of human health were major concerns for multiple months last summer. So what we did, and is in the Southwest area, is we developed a coordinated response to smoke management, to human health, and to smoke impacts, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So we'll walk through the process we used and developed in the Southwest area in response to the fire season. We'll talk about how the Southwest area addressed smoke impacts, what lessons that we learned from that from last summer, and where do we go from here, how do we move forward. So the 2011 fire season set records for total acres burned in the Southwest area, which is shown here on this graph. Approximately 2.4 million acres burned. And those acreages came from federal land managers, state, and private in the Southwest area, so Arizona, New Mexico, and portions of West Texas. The Wallow Fire in Arizona and the Los Conchas Fire in New Mexico both set records in each state for the largest fires in recorded history. Prior to that, the records for largest fires were the Rodeo Chetasky Fire of about 500,000 acres and the Dry Lakes Fire down on the Gila National Forest, which was about 95,000 acres. So as you can see here, there were multiple large fires that burned in New Mexico, Arizona, and in Mexico throughout the early spring and the summer prior to the onset of the monsoons. And this resulted in long-term cumulative smoke impacts. So when we reflect now backwards over the last couple of years, there were several environmental indicators which suggested that last summer would be a very active fire season. And some of these were the El Nino La Nina cycle. In 2010 in the Southwest area, we were under the influence of an El Nino cycle. The Southwest area was, right in the storm track, which resulted in an abundance of fine fuels throughout both New Mexico, Arizona, and West Texas. However, the El Nino cycle weakened during the fall of 2010, and the La Nina pattern was stronger during the winter and the spring of 2011. So we were wet, a lot of moisture right in the storm track, and then that weakened and we got into a very, very dry pattern starting the fall of 2011 that continued through the winter and into the spring of 2011. And by April, much of the region was at less than 50% of snowpack, and when we looked at our fine fuels across the region, there was little to no green up which occurred. The southwest area was also very warm and windy, as the jet stream was situated just north of both Arizona and New Mexico in Colorado. So winds persisted well into June, and these were large-scale, regional type west-southwest, very dry winds. And then also in February of 2011, a record cold spell was experienced throughout the southwest area. And this cold spell lasted several days, and it had pronounced effects on the southern parts of the geographic area. And so when you think of the two states, and you probably cut the states in half, the southern half of those states, there was a tremendous amount of frost kill in both the oaks and the shrubs. And so when you add up these factors, there was really no surprise that we anticipated we'd have a very active fire season in 2011, which played out. In fact, it became the most active fire season in recorded history. So based on our knowledge of the potential for the upcoming fire season, in March we recognized that there was the potential for a long, very active fire season, and that the toll on human health, if we didn't start addressing the potential for smoke, could be tremendous. And so we, early on, even before we started getting fires in the southwest area, coordinated and developed talking points. And the talking points specifically addressed the potential of a long active fire season, environmental factors, which we just talked about, that could result in an active fire season, and some of the basic public safety precautions that could be taken. These smoke talking points were released to the media and also to the public. This effort was quickly followed up with a joint press release with the New Mexico Environmental Department, Air Quality, the Health Department, and the Forest Service. And this press release really focused more on human health and mitigations people could take if they were sensitive to smoke. So later on in March, and we get into April, and then we start having fires become pretty active. We've got fires, there are fires down in Mexico, and fire activity is starting to occur in southern Arizona and southern New Mexico. And one fire in particular prompted even a higher level of discussion about smoke management and the need for coordinated efforts. And that was the Miller Fire, which was burned on the Gila National Forest in the middle of the Gila Wilderness. And even though the area that this fire burned in had seen multiple entries over the last several decades, smoke was still, there was quite a bit of smoke still coming off that fire that came across the Continental Divide into the Rio Grande Valley and ended up on several occasions impacting the communities along the Rio Grande and into the greater Albuquerque area. And although a number of incident management teams were involved in the management of this incident, early on it was recognized that the incident management teams could address smoke impacts at the local level with the communities that are immediately adjacent to the fire. However, the teams could not probably address smoke impacts that were occurring hundreds and hundreds of miles away. And that really prompted the discussion of how do we address smoke management, cumulative smoke impacts at the geographic area level. So the Miller Fire is burning. There's a lot of activity beginning in southeast and southern Arizona. We have fires in Mexico, and then the Wallow Fire occurs. And so the fire activity started to increase and move up into the northern tiers of both of those states. And the Wallow Fire started on May 30th. That's when it was detected. This fire grew very rapidly and had a lot of daily growth, and when we look back at the records, on average for about the first 2 weeks this fire burned about 30,000 acres a day. The fire burned predominantly, it was up on the Mogollon Rim in Arizona and was burning predominantly in ponderosa pine and lower elevation mixed conifer. And the area that this fire burned in had little to no fire history, recorded fire history in it. So it was the landscape was departed. So shown here is a satellite picture that was taken on the Wallow Fire on June 7th. And on June 7th, this fire grew approximately 77,000 acres. Well, it just so happened on June 7th, Josh and I were headed over to the state line there to a little community named Camado, which is about 50 or 60 miles away from the state line there, right in the middle of that smoke. And we were going out and we were deploying air monitors in several locations. And as we traveled over to deploy this air monitor at Camado, and then we drove on up to Grants, which is on the I-40 corridor, and then back into Arizona, you know, we were sort of overwhelmed by the amount of smoke that was in the area. And we estimated that visibility throughout the duration of our trip that day was probably less than 3 miles. So this went from Albuquerque to the state line of Arizona and New Mexico, and then we drove back on I-40 and all the way back up into Santa Fe. Visibility was extremely reduced, and the thing that we noticed and we talked about quite a bit during this trip was there was no public information in terms of road safety and slow down, smoke, low visibility. There was no signage out, and that was sort of alarming to us. So we knew there was a need for a coordinated response and that the Southwest area was in uncharted grounds. At this point in early June, there were broad-scale cumulative impacts, health impacts on the public. The region really was just entering our peak fire season. Our fire season in the Southwest area really is very active through June until the onset of the monsoon season, which usually occurs in early July. And where we were at that time, there was no relief in sight, and there was a high probability of additional large fires occurring throughout the area. We recognize that the incident management teams assigned to large fires across the region really did not have the capacity to address smoke impacts hundreds and hundreds of miles away from their incident, and we knew there was an immediate need to address public health and safety. So very quickly, basically overnight, there was a coordinated effort was put into place to address public health and safety. And this occurred at unprecedented levels in the Southwest area. So within about a 24 to 48 hour period, we set up daily conference calls, and up to 75 participants representing numerous agencies dialed into these calls daily. And some of the agencies involved included the Departments of Environmental Quality in both New Mexico and Arizona, the National Weather Service, Department of Health, all the federal land management agencies and state forestry, Department of Homeland Security, and then predictive services out of the Southwest Coordination Center were on these calls daily. And as we worked through these calls and became more organized, much of the effort focused on monitoring needs, modeling needs, and messaging. And so now I'm going to turn this over to Josh, and he's going to talk in a lot more detail about these 3 items.
So I want to iterate again how multi-agency this was in terms of trying to communicate a concise, unified daily statement to the public and health impacts about smoke. This would never have happened without a lot of help from a lot of people. I think we were fortunate enough to have brought in people from the Washington office, Pete Lom, who had quite a bit of experience in Arizona and was leading up the smoke efforts for the Forest Service, and he was able to come in and really start coordinating this effort and pulling together a lot of help, as well as my counterpart in Arizona, Ron Sharon. We had our own networks in both New Mexico and Arizona, but we needed bring that together and have a unified message. The impacts were great in the city of Albuquerque, so we needed to pull people in from there. We had folks from the National Weather Service from all of the field offices in both Arizona and New Mexico, and they had started getting out high split runs pretty early on, showing some of what some of the impacts were. But they were critical to the effort. Chuck Maxwell at the Southwest Coordinating Center was critical to helping coordinate what was going on here, as well as people from the New Mexico Environment Department, Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, and the WFDA support was critical, and then the Air Fire team, which is part of the research branch of the Forest Service in the Pacific Northwest, and I have to especially note Miriam Rorwig, who I borrowed some of her slides in this presentation. So this could not have happened without all of those people. So the monitoring and modeling that we did, this is just a screen capture from Google Earth, and shows one of the arrays that we had of monitors set out at one point for the summer. The Forest Service, we probably deployed between 15 to 20 monitors over the summer. Arizona Department of Environmental Quality deployed monitors. New Mexico Environment Department deployed monitors in addition to the existing network that the city of Albuquerque had, and both the environment departments in both states. Los Alamos National Lab monitors air quality near there. And so we, part of the daily discussion is, where do the monitors need to be, where are we seeing impacts, and using them also to help verify some of the modeling that was going on. This screen capture also shows, this was later in the summer, and it shows smoke signatures from blue sky. So a little bit of the Wallow, I guess I can use these, so a little bit of the Wallow that's occurring here. I guess maybe I need a different pen. Here, Los Conchas is here. There's a Pacheco fire also occurring here, and then Donaldson fire is occurring down in the south. And so this was just one, one screenshot that we'd be essentially looking at. So we're having multiple fires that are occurring. The smoke was, incredible. We had smoke plumes going, talking to the Weather Service, 45,000, feet above ground level from some of these pyrocumulonimbus clouds, and it just, dumping smoke far, far away. And as I was putting some of this together, I came across the U.S. Smog Blog in Baltimore, and they were even talking about having some of the effects that they were even noticing in Baltimore, just to show how far some of the smoke was going. But what we were looking at every day is, this shows some of the monitors we had on the date, what the daily growth is for some of these fires that were occurring, and it also talks about, what were the impacts. And I think we had to decide how to talk about impacts. And so we used this template that we developed. So part of this is based on the air quality index that the EPA puts out for PM 2.5, but then the two middle columns, well, the middle column looking at these acute effects of 1 to 3 hour averages, because communities may be getting impacts that are hitting 100, 200, 1,000 parts per million or micrograms per meter cubed PM 2.5, but then they may have periods of much lower concentrations. And so this was developed in part of the efforts in 2008 or after the 2008 wildfires in California, pulled from the Guide for Public Health Officials in California, and this was pulled together through people at the California Air Resources Board, EPA Region 9, and a lot of public health officials to start looking at what some of these acute impacts were. It also shows what the concentrations were at the 24-hour average, which is what regulatory they're looking at in terms of the 24-hour averages. And then we also needed to, if we didn't have monitors in a place, is look at visibility. And I need to make sure that folks are aware that the visibility data here is pulled, and this is information that I got from the U.S. Forest Service. I think Smoke Farm team had pulled some information together about where this data comes from. This is only based on one study in the in Montana. It's being picked up by a lot of people, but I think it's really probably only appropriate for looking at kind of this Rocky Mountain region, which has very arid conditions and probably is not appropriate for more humid conditions. But we also really relied heavily on using visibility in terms of our messaging. So I think it was important here, but we had to very quickly come to an agreement, you know, as an interagency group. How do we talk about impacts? What do impacts mean? And how are we going to go forward when we're communicating to the public? So every single day, this is another screen capture of a part of one of the products that was made daily and to help guide our calls. And this was also posted on INSEE Web and the Southwest Coordinating Center website. But we would look at, you know, what's the 1 hour peak that we might pick at, and it has a timestamp associated with that for monitors that were set up. We also looked at 8-hour peak and the 24-hour peak that occurred to see what are the maximum impacts, and then we picked whichever one of these had the highest impacts. That was the adjective rating for air quality that we you know, added. So we just wanted to come to a common understanding of what these impacts meant, and we're talking about them in the same way. And this was summarized daily on the phone calls. The next, here's a screen capture from a product that was produced by the WFDA support team, and it was provided to the Air Fire folks up in the Pacific Northwest as an input to their models for Blue Sky. And part of the challenge that we had was with the amount of activity, one, that was occurring, and two, the communication was very difficult between anyone on these fires. They had their hands full and communications networks weren't set up, but we needed to have some information about the fire and what was going on. And fortunately, there was a team supporting all of the large incidents in the Southwest that we were able to tap into, and they were able to provide information about growth of these fires and what the model runs were showing was going to happen the next 1 to 2 days out. And so this information that was critical for our model inputs was, you know, was pulled, you know, far away. But I think we kind of learned that, you know, we can't always use traditional sources to communicate with these fires, and we needed to be flexible and adapt to some extent. And it was a very critical piece in what we were pulling together. So the inputs from WFDA support were given to some researchers at the Pacific Northwest to do blue sky modeling, and they, you know, every day pulled together a modeling report where this was verified against, you know, monitoring data, and then looked at in terms of, you know, moderate growth to large growth, you know, on the fire. So multiple runs were done, and then we talked about it on the phone calls with this group of people to start coming up with, you know, where do we think the impacts are going to be, and, you know, where's our confidence, and what sort of message do we have to get out. So, you know, each of these runs, you know, varied magnitude, timing, duration, and where was the smoke going to go. So this is another product that was produced when we were getting large-scale regional impacts, showing, you know, where we thought the smoke was going to go. And again, these were posted on INCIWeb, New Mexico Fire Info, the SWIC website, to show, and these were, you know, picked up by media all over the place. You heard it on the radio driving to work. You heard it, you know, on the news channels. National Weather Service was posting the same information, and I think, you know, that was very critical, and it gets back to this idea of, you know, public notification. I think when we recognize the growing body of research that's showing some of the acute effects and impacts to the public, you know, the only thing we can do is get the message and word out to people. And we had, you know, one message that was coming out from all of everybody was on these phone calls, was saying the exact same things based on the best information we could have. You know, the key elements that were always included in here is, you know, what are the expected impacts to various communities based on the air quality index, and using the language that was used specifically for that. You know, but also kind of giving people, you know, the smoke is going to vary both, you know, during the day and you know, throughout the geographic area. There was always a statement about, you know, caution while driving, emphasizing personal responsibility in terms of your choices. If it's smoky outside and you have impaired, you know, health, you know, it's probably a good idea not to go outside. You know, but the other thing is, you know, these are just forecasts based on models, and there is some uncertainty with that as well. So we're doing our best to inform where we think the smoke is going to be and the concentrations at the ground. But, you know, there's quite a bit of uncertainty with that. And so we really kind of emphasize this idea of visibility, recognizing there's quite a bit of uncertainty that's associated with it, but it was a common way that the group felt comfortable talking about that. And I think we always ended the statement, your eyes are your best tools to determine if it's safe to be outside. Now again, this isn't probably appropriate for everywhere, but I think it is appropriate for the Southwest region. One of the interesting, I think, synergies that occurred, and it's also one of the challenges that we had, is when the fire transitioned from the largest fire in Arizona to the largest fire in New Mexico, and it happens to be burning around a national lab that has a history of, you know, issues with radioactivity. The researchers from Lawrence Livermore, I think it's the National Atmospheric Release Advisory Center, came in case there was going to be a radiological release, and we got to the researchers at Pacific Northwest were able to model with a very high resolution data set. And one of the products that we saw as we were doing this is, one night we saw that there was going to be a potential for significant smoke impact on one of the major, you know, transportation networks on I-25. And so we wrote a press release that got picked up by the Albuquerque Journal and posted on New Mexico Fire Info that talked about potential low visibility on I-25. And I think, you know, that was one of the really interesting things that occurred is how people really came together, you know, because it was a long fire season in the Southwest. You know, for me, it started with the Miller Fire in the beginning of May and didn't end until late July. And I think that the other challenge that we start having is there's different groups who are changing. You know, everyone was involved in both states when we're talking about the Wallow Fire. But as we start transitioning to more impacts in New Mexico, a lot of people in Arizona dropped off, but then we have, you know, new folks that are coming involved and engaged in from the Arizona Department of Homeland Security to the New Mexico Department of Homeland Security. They're doing all this EPA radiological monitoring all over the place, and we had to decide at that point that, you know, we're focusing on specifically smoke impacts and doing that. But I think, you know, this is one of those things as you keep going on in a summer of trying to address some of these challenges of kind of changing from one incident to the next, and how the people change. So I want to talk about some of the data that we have and from some of the impacts. And so starting with kind of impacts to firefighters, this is a screen capture shot from the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality's website showing one of the monitors that was set up in fire camp in Springerville. And you can see it shows both in the chart in the bar graph the 1 hour averages, and then the black line is the 24-hour averages that are occurring, and this fits, you know, very much consistently in the very unhealthy to hazardous level in camp. And one of the impacts that happened as a result of this is from resources. Some of the firefighters, after their 14 days, were asked to extend, and they lost some hotshot crews because they were battling the smoke and fire all day long, and then came back to camp and just couldn't get out of the smoke. And I think people's health started to become impaired, and they started losing some teams as a result of this. And so we started, you know, really pushing the teams to be considering what they can be doing, whether it's getting clean air trailers, rotating people in and out of these areas. But I think it became a very significant issue in the Southwest in terms of what are some of these impacts in terms of firefighters specifically, and we can talk a little bit later about some of the efforts we've made after this to kind of start addressing some of these going forward. But here's again some impacts that occurred in Albuquerque over the time, and what you can see is the blue represents the growth, daily growth in the Wallow Fire, which is represented on the left-hand axis. And then the red and yellow bars, the red refers to what the max 1 hour measured values of PM 2.5 were in Albuquerque on given days, and the yellow represents potential exceedances of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards based on the 24-hour average. But you can see that during this first week of Wallow, the impacts were significant in Albuquerque, as represented. The values are on the right-hand side of the graph, and they had days above 200 micrograms per meter cubed, many potential exceedances in the town, and I think this was really, wearing on people in that community and became a very significant issue. And the thing that's amazing, and as Emily talked to, the recognition that teams who are 150 miles away can't be addressing these kind of impacts. It really needed to have a much more regional approach. The next slide shows impacts in Los Alamos. Again, this is looking at PM 2.5 concentrations, and again, you have very significant impacts that occurred 180 miles away from the Wallow Fire in Los Alamos early on, where they had, again, the 24-hour average. These are all values that would potentially exceed the standard of 35 micrograms per meter cubed, plus the blue bars are the 1 hour max. And I think the other thing to note is, proximity does still matter, because you can see the impacts of, over 1,300 micrograms per meter cubed at a 1 hour average that was measured on the 30th of June from the Los Conchas fire. Another thing that I want to highlight about this is, and again, it signifies the challenges of dealing with various communities after evacuations. A Wallow Fire had to evacuate Alpine, Arizona because of issues concerning the fire burning through town. After the concern for fire had been burning up homes had been lifted, they still kept people out of Alpine for several days because of smoke. And when they did go back, they were handed literature about what the potential impacts are from smoke, and I think they recommended that people who have cardiovascular or respiratory issues may want to stay out of the area for a while. They also had to evacuate Los Alamos, but unfortunately the same kind of coordination didn't necessarily occur there, and folks were let back into Los Alamos without any significant warning, very early in June, when there was still significant impacts from smoke, even though there was no more concern about necessarily public safety from fire. And so this was again, something that I think we learned about and are continuing to work on in the Southwest in terms of raising air quality as an issue when people want to get back into their houses. So I'm going to hand this back to Emily to talk about, and I think we'll probably tag team this a little, maybe.
Okay, so to wrap up the webinar here, we would like to share with you some of the lessons learned from this fire season of 2011. And probably the first one that we wanted to touch on was networks and the networks of monitors, and just the magnitude of monitors that were deployed throughout the Southwest area from all agencies, and how do you prepare for that need, and do you have that capacity locally? So what do you have locally within your geographic area that can be deployed? Having a good understanding of your partners' capabilities to deploy monitors, and do you need to augment your supply, through the Boise cache or up from Boise? And having a good understanding of that capacity and discussing that early in the fire season is something that we would continue to do in the future. The other thing, there were many lessons learned. Another one was the common message, and I think out of everything that we went through last summer trying to protect and inform the public on their health, probably the most powerful thing is that we had a common message. So all agencies worked cooperatively and collectively to agree upon a message that could be shared throughout the Southwest area to the media, to the public, and that became very, very powerful because we didn't have one agency pointing or pitting towards another one. And again, the value of that coordinated message and having those relationships and those ideas flowing before fire season are important. Another lesson was really having a good understanding of a geographic area's technical capability. So what skills do you have locally or regionally to deploy monitors, and as importantly as fires, the incident winds down, to redeploy and relocate those monitors throughout your geographic areas? Again, that common understanding about who can do what, and to be able to deploy and have this capacity and respond very rapidly is important. For us down in the Southwest area, because of the magnitude of the fire, we were very fortunate to have a decision support team that was down here from the national office, that Tom Zimmerman used to have up there. And we had many of their people that are in that national group sitting down here in our office. And if we didn't have them here to help support the modeling, the smoke modeling, it would have been very problematic, because again, as Josh mentioned, it was very difficult to get a hold of individual incident management teams. They were very busy. They had a lot going on, but yet there really was a need to address public health. And so having this WFDS team in place in the Southwest area, and they were on our phone calls, our coordinated phone calls, and we'd come in and we would help set priorities on these are the fires that we would like modeled. And again, they would use the weather information, the fuels information, and project fire growth, and then that could be sent up to the Pacific Northwest Research Station. So You know, I would say in our geographic area, we do have skills in modeling, but when you get to those levels of incident and the need for response, being able to pull people in from outside your geographic area, I would encourage people not to be reluctant to do that and draw from everybody and as quickly as possible as things escalate. One thing we know we need to continue to do in our geographic area is training and training and training, whether that's modeling skills, how to set up and deploy smoke monitors, and even training on how do we communicate a common message about fire and emissions. And this will continue to be a challenge for all federal agencies, you know, as budgets continue to be reduced and we have travel caps. So how do we work around that to be successful in the future? You know, we talked about the coordinated message and the value of that and the products that went into that message. And the one thing that I think back on that was very helpful is those products were really written in very, what I would call layman's terms. And so when people wanted to know about the potential smoke impacts in a given area, they could go to our Southwest coordination site and we posted those products and updated those daily, which really reduced the impact, I think, to the forests and the agencies hosting fires. And again, the message was written so that it could be understood by people who didn't necessarily have a technical background in smoke management or health. Safety of incident personnel. You know, Josh showed some information, some data that was pulled from a monitor in our fire camps, and I think the one thing that we learned and that we're taking into the future is that we talk a lot about safety of incident personnel, and I think in our region we're very committed to that, and our teams are also. But I think after this summer there is probably a heightened awareness with our incident management teams, and we've had discussions with them on when they go out on future incidents and where do we locate camps. And I think that discussion will be in the forefront and will be part of the criterion. Smoke will be part of that criterion when people consider where camps should be located or could be located. And as importantly, if we know we're going to put a camp in an area that there could be impacts to incident personnel, the robust discussion about how do we mitigate that. And I think that message, you know, Josh and other people in our geographic area went and talked to the incident management teams and provided them information similar to what was presented today to heighten their awareness. And you know, for the first time in my personal experience, really, and Josh hit on this as smoke was discussed, when a community is evacuated, and then from a fire standpoint the community is safe to re-enter, but now what about smoke and what about health, and having that discussion with public officials about, so from a fire perspective it's safe to re-enter, but from an emergency services perspective, does a local community have the capacity to put people who might be at risk back into the community, and what those impacts might be on emergency services. And you know, those discussions were ongoing in the Southwest area this year, and based on my experience, that was the first time I think they were ever disclosed and discussed at that length. So into the future, you know, again, the importance of reaching out, having discussions, building relationships, communicating, developing plans with incident management teams, partners, and the interagency community are efforts that we've focused on this winter for future fire seasons. Time and effort's been put in about training on both modeling and also on the deployment of monitors. We're working on communication plans on how we can communicate and thresholds of when we should communicating about wildfires both in New Mexico and Arizona. And again, I think we'll see a lot of interest in research in the Southwest area coming out of this fire season on health impacts, you know, associated with people with acute acute smoke impacts, both in terms of public health and to the firefighters that were assigned to these incidents. There were a lot of positive things that came out of this summer also, and this may, I guess it depends on how you look at this, but we did get a good coordinated public message out that was very timely, and it allowed people to make personal decisions about their health. For example, in Albuquerque we have a semi-professional baseball team here, and based on the information and products that were produced, some of their games were postponed, they were delayed, and people really could make a choice about whether they wanted to go to the ballpark or not, or take their kid to soccer practice. We really stepped up the delivery and providing information about visibility on roadways, and I think we turned the corner on that. People were very aware of the times and the locations where there could be poor air quality based on where fires were burning, and we really had the opportunity to bring in science-based tools to look at and to inform our decision making. So those were the lessons learned from the fire season and things that we're working on this year. That concludes our webinar. Again, we wanted to set the stage for the 2011 wildfire season, and we talked a lot about the coordinated response and the monitoring and the products that were developed to help inform the public on health. And then we wrapped up with the lessons that we learned and products that we're working on to better ourselves into the future. And so I believe that's all we had to present, and we will now turn this back over to Josh for questions, if there are any.
Okay. Well, Josh and Emily, thank you. That was really interesting. I think this is something that everyone in fire management is dealing with, and this is a really good example of sort of thinking on your feet and getting something going. That was really interesting. There's a few questions. I'll go ahead and get into them. If you're out there, and go ahead and get your questions in, and we'll start answering them here right now. First up is Paul Brokoff, and Paul's from the Department of Sustainability and Environment in Victoria, Australia. So Paul is up bright and early in the morning to listen on the webinar. That's kind of cool. All right, but Paul asks, what kind of high-res model was used by the researchers at Lawrence Livermore?
And I'm going to have to apologize because I can't remember exactly what it was. I think the resolution was down to 1.5 kilometers in terms of the model they're using, but I can get that information and follow up with that.
Okay. Also, and this is sort of more of a can you provide more information type thing. Michelle Fiddler's wanting to know if you can provide a copy of the uniform messages / talking points that you mentioned.
Yeah, and we can. I can provide some of the language that we used as well. And I'll talk to you, Josh, I guess, how to get.
Yes, what I could do is you could send it to me, and I can post it on Advances in Fire Practice along with the recording. Where in the same place, so we put the recording of the webinar. So right up at the top, there's sort of the webinars listed, and behind that there will be click here to be recorded webinar, and then below that I'll stick a copy of that document. I can upload it if you like.
Sure, and I'll probably what I can do is just send a couple examples of some of the products that were produced that have the language that was used, and then a few different examples of that, so people can see that. Okay,
and if everybody out there is wanting to access this, the Advances in Fire Practice, you can Google it or sort of navigate your way to it through the Lessons Learned Center website. I'll try to get up there later this afternoon, at least the recording up. Next question is from Jim Brenner, and he wants to know was there any law enforcement coordination for visibility on roadways, for example, the Highway Patrol, were they involved?
They were. We did have people from Department of Homeland Security and the emergency operations groups on our calls. There was also, I think, separate information that was going on in terms of just the typical posting of the visibility, signs up on roads that was being handled by the teams. But that was definitely one of the challenges that we had as we transferred from the emergency operations in Arizona to emergency operations in New Mexico, and the whole new group of people, and trying to understand what we had already been doing for several weeks already. So we were coordinating with that, but it was definitely one of the challenges that we had.
Okay. The next is more of a comment from John Kennedy, and he's wanting to point out that the California Air Response Planning Alliance, CARPA, has resources, coordination model, and a website, and that can help. The Forest Service is on the CARPA steering committee because we address wildland fire. So there are some resources there, John's pointing out. So if you can make your way to the CARPA website, that's the California Air Response Planning Alliance. Stephen, I'm probably going to mess this up. Maurer asks, how much information was posted to the various social media outlets, i.e. Facebook, etc.? As an agency, we are blocked from even accessing them to see what is going on.
And we were not posting anything directly to any of those sites. I think, you know, the community may have been picking up on some of, and we did get some feedback that individuals would link to, say, the Southwest Coordinating site, you know, on say a Twitter feed or a Facebook page to post some of the products we had, and I know I talked to someone in Los Alamos at one point, and that's how they found it, through a Facebook page, and ended up calling me at some point. But we as agency personnel weren't posting any things to Facebook.
Okay.
But incident management teams, I think, have a little bit more flexibility, but I'm not sure exactly. Some of them do set up sites like this, but that was, and if they posted some of the products we had, that was kind of a different situation, but we weren't directly engaged in that.
Okay. Ann Hobbs asks, what were the exact air monitors that were used?
So the Forest Service, we deployed mostly e-samplers. The state of New Mexico and Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, the monitors they were deploying were EBAMs. The one at Los Alamos National Lab, they have two up there, and they're both TOMs. But was a whole variety of monitors set out. The monitors in Albuquerque and the ones operated by New Mexico Environment Department, some of them are federal reference, federal equivalent monitors, some are not. So it was kind of a mishmash of monitors. And so I think, you know, at least when we talk amongst ourselves, we're really looking at relative impacts rather than the precision of the monitoring equipment to kind of understand what the impacts were.
Okay. Helen Graham asks, what would you suggest as trigger points for reaching beyond local monitoring? Are there concentration levels or durations that you would use as trigger points?
And I think it's a great question, and one I think we're struggling with here. You know, I think you know, there's a recognition that what we had last summer was it may never happen again. Or with the trend of bigger fires and more fires in the Southwest, we may be seeing, you know, this may happen, you know, once a decade or a couple times a decade. But I think that we're just going to have to be monitoring incidents very closely, and if they start having some of the activity we saw last year, you know, I think we'll be in close coordination with, you know, I think our interagency partners and with the state to try and make that determination. But I think we're still struggling with, when does this go from something that's handled by individual teams addressing the impacts to local communities versus something where we're seeing impacts, you know, 100 miles away. So, you know, it's probably not the most satisfying answer, but I think it's a challenge.
Yeah. Okay. I'm probably going to screw the name up. Sorry in advance. Jia Yun Yao. How's the performance of blue sky modeling comparing to the monitoring data?
And I really should have pulled in folks from Pacific Northwest on this to answer that question. I'm probably not the person to respond to that. I think sometimes it performed very well and people were very pleased, and they did play around with, I think, some of the meteorological models to see what, based on what resolution they were getting. But I think that it's a good question, and hopefully a research project that people will be diving into. But I think it performed pretty well, and it seemed like from our observations it did, but really nailing it down into, I think it again goes down to relative impacts. We are pretty good about understanding, this area is going to get higher concentrations of smoke, but, were we good about saying, is it, unhealthy versus hazardous? I don't think it was quite there. But I think for relative impacts, it performed pretty well.
Okay. Next we have a question and a comment from Richard Wilson. It's great that we were able to get this information out to the general public. Do we have a coordinated way to also relay what the health hazards are? We are good at telling the public about the smoke impact, but I believe we need to coordinate the health impact questions as well.
And I think this was included in our what we tried to do is using the air quality index and the language that was specific to that, and we did have people from the Washington office at EPA who did get engaged on this and working closely with the health department to talk about what impacts were. But and so I don't know if that's exactly what your question was in terms of telling people what those impacts are, but I think we identified individuals who are most at risk and what some of those potential impacts could be, but I think that really understanding and communicating very well about the acute impacts is still emerging science and a challenge for us.
Right. Okay. Did you use EBAMs for your monitoring, and was the hourly data iStreamed to the public for public information purposes?
Yeah, and I answered part of this in terms of the monitoring equipment, and we did have this posted on, and this was the unfortunate problem. It was all posted, real time or maybe an hour delay, but the problem is it was linked to, say, Arizona Department of Environmental Quality for those monitors. U.S. Forest, we had service. We had our monitors going to two different sites, the SatGuard site in the Western Regional Climate Center, and then New Mexico Environment Department, their monitors were there. And I think that was one of the things we identified afterwards. And I know that at a national level, they've been talking and trying to coordinate somewhat with getting linked into the AirNow system for some of this data. So it's more kind of one-stop shop, but it was posted, but it wasn't necessarily very public-friendly. So you kind of had to know where to go depending on which monitor you wanted to find out data for.
Okay. Julie Rogers asks, having clean air trailers for firefighters off duty in heavy smoke areas is a superb idea. Are you pursuing having these available this summer? How about also smoke-free environments available for sensitive members of the public?
Yeah, and I don't know. This is something I think that the geographic regions would address in terms of their availability and the teams. It's not, I think we're still in a process of educating teams and firefighters and giving them information in terms of what their options are for firefighters. And as far as smoke-free environments, I know we've had this conversation at the forest level of when you do have incidents, have you identified a place, kind of a smoke-free haven where you can go to? And I think there were some, recommendations that were made and places opened in, say, Albuquerque last summer, whether it was a mall or a recreation center where people could go to get out of the smoke. But I think this is something that is another kind of area where it's good to start thinking about. I know we had this conversation on the Miller fire last year. We opened evacuation centers for people to go to when their homes might burn down, but trying to open up that dialogue with the teams to start identifying areas early on where people can go to get out of smoke. But I think this happens on a much more ad hoc basis rather than something that, but I think it's a really good point.
Okay. Tim Radke asked, did you coordinate with the safety officers, and was there any personal monitoring to determine firefighter exposures?
We did coordinate with safety officers, and we're in pretty good discussion with the regional safety officer who communicated out, and at some point I think Pete Lum ended up going to some of the camps to talk to the safety officers on the Wallow Fire. There, I think, was some research done putting on some carbon monoxide monitors on some firefighters on the Wallow Fire, and maybe even, and I may be remembering this wrong, looking at issues of like crystal and silica for firefighters. But in terms of PM, there was no personal monitoring that was going on for firefighters in those areas.
Okay. James Dunn wants to know what was the total duration for the incidents in the Southwest, and points out that it could happen again this year.
Yeah, so we can find that out on the looking just at the SWA site, but I think that there was really significant activity in the Southwest, especially in the South and the East of New Mexico and Texas in April, and there were significant events because the monsoon really, which is the sign of the end of our season, probably didn't come in full effect until mid-July. And so I think we were pretty active in the Southwest from April to mid-July last summer.
Okay. Tony Duckminton wants to know what channels of communication were used to inform the community: radio, TV, newspaper, website, social media, etc. What was the feedback from the community?
So we posted our products on NCWeb, the individual incidents did, New Mexico Fire Info, and the Southwest Coordinating Center had the products posted daily. We also, since we had folks from emergency operations and the weather service, they also took the products and wrapped that into the language for warnings they were doing, and these were consistently heard on radio and TV programs throughout the geographic area. We tried to, in terms of feedback from the community, we did do some Google Analytics to see what kind of hits we were getting, but it was, I think, a little bit imprecise, because if say, the radio program or the TV station picks that up and then they post it somewhere else, or they have it on there, it's hard to really understand that. But I think we, at least in the personal interactions I had with the public, they were very thankful. But in any sort of kind of, I think more research methods to understand our effectiveness, I think that is, I'm not sure how I'd answer that.
Okay. Peter Olson asked, did you find any difficulties in getting information from teams on the fires about planned activities such as burnout operations that impact smoke output?
Yeah, I think that was, and that's some of the outreach we've been doing this season already. Is we presented at the incident management team meeting for the Southwest region in Prescott a few months ago, and basically asked for a technical contact on these teams who could be providing us with information, because I think we were lucky to have the WFDIS support team that was supporting the region, but I think that ideally we could all get into WFDIS and pull that information out to help feed the models, but at some point having those people who are on the teams who know or have the best ideas of what's occurring is really critical, and something we've really tried to beef up this year to improve that communication. But it was a challenge last year.
Okay. And this is the last question, and thank you, Josh. You've worked your way through quite a list of questions here. This is from Bob Nunez, who also thanks you for the informative discussion. Was monitoring conducted in the still smoky reentry areas?
And yeah, we left monitors up if we thought there was going to continue to be impacts. And a lot of the places we had were dedicated existing networks where the monitors were still there. So, right, and Emily is pointing out that part of the, I think, public information, especially with the Wallow Fire, post-fire, was talking about blowing ash and potential visibility issues with air, because the wind last summer in the southwest area was really unprecedented. It was just hot and windy for, it's usually April and May when we have those kind of events, but we were having that prolonged many days through July where it was continuing that way, which helps explain some of the growth on some of these fires. But yeah, we had monitors that we would leave in place for many days afterwards before we moved them around. Okay.
Well, Josh and Emily, I want to thank you both for a really interesting discussion and a really interesting case of smoke management, working with the public, and really trying to solve some questions that a lot of people out there are dealing with. We look forward to hearing more about it. So thank you for coming. I appreciate it. All right. So
and I'll send you some of those products we had, and I'll try and find out which model was used on from NERL.
Right. And for anyone else out there, I'll try to get this up as quick as the recording of the webinar up as quick as I can, and we'll try to get some of those documents uploaded as well, and you can find those on Advances in Fire Practice. All right, well, thanks everyone for coming, and check back for the next webinar coming up May 3rd, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.